This chapter looks at delinquent peers with a strong focus on gangs. So, how do delinquent peers impact delinquency? This is typically the strongest correlate of delinquency and the strongest predictor of it. This is due to several reasons. Delinquent peers cause delinquency, third variables cause both, and delinquency causes delinquent peers. And you can see here this common pattern of progression. Juveniles associate with mildly delinquent peers. This leads to minor delinquency, which leads to associating with more delinquent peers, which leads to more serious delinquency. So, what conditions strengthen the impact of delinquent peers? If all your friends are delinquent, if they form a cohesive group, if you like those friends and spend a lot of time with them, if those friends hold beliefs conducive to delinquency, approve of your delinquency, and pressure you to engage in delinquency, and these effects are mostly explained by social learning theory. So, thinking about delinquent peer groups, most commit minor delinquent acts on an occasional basis, while some commit more frequent and serious delinquent acts. There are both offending groups and accomplice networks. Offending groups are groups that actually commit delinquent acts together, and they're usually, 2 to 4 juveniles. Accomplice networks, though, are pools of potential co offenders with an average size of about 7 juveniles. Group members are typically similar in age and sex. Most are male, offending peaks at ages 15 to 18, while females are more likely to be part of mixed sex groups. There are instigators and followers. Instigators are the same age or a little older than other group members. Females are more likely to follow male instigators than males are to follow female instigators. In one group of friends, a kid may be the instigator, and in another group of friends, a follower. The quality of the relationships between these group members are similar to those found in conventional peer groups, but they are more likely to report getting into conflicts with one another than conventional peer groups. So, what effect do delinquent peers have on delinquency? And the slide seems to be a little bit messed up. In terms of social learning theory, they reinforce and provide delinquent role models. They reduce fears of direct controls and reduce stake in conformity. And as far as labeling theory goes, they're much more likely to be labeled as delinquent. So, why do juveniles get involved with delinquent peers? Let's look at some of the traits and experiences we've already talked about. Individual traits of irritability and low self control increase the likelihood of being rejected by conventional peers. A strong need for thrill and excitement makes them more attracted to delinquent peers and the activities in which they engage. Family variables can promote delinquency, increase the likelihood of association with delinquent peer groups. Negative school experiences increase the likelihood of association with delinquent peer groups. Living in deprived inner city communities, and delinquent behavior itself increases the likelihood of associating with delinquent peers. You're going to prefer delinquent peers and are most likely to be rejected by your conventional peers. Let's look at gangs more specifically. So, gangs differ greatly from one another. Some are large, highly organized, and heavily involved in drug sales, and others are small or loosely organized. And there's various definitions of street gangs, but Klein defines a gang as an identifiable group of youngsters with certain characteristics. So, they're perceived as a distinct group. They recognize themselves as such, and they're involved in a sufficient number of delinquent acts to elicit negative responses from residents and law enforcement. Some alternative definitions focus on territories and turfs and formal organizational structures. But they're generally defined as a durable, street organized youth group whose involvement in illegal activity is part of its group identity. In the US in 2012, the most recent National Youth Gang Center survey, whose results have been published, there are an estimated 30,000 gangs and 850,000 gang members throughout 3,100 jurisdictions with gang problems. The number of gang-related homicides increased 20% from 2011 to 2012. In terms of self-report studies for the U.S. as a whole, 2% of adolescents belong to gangs in a given year, and 5% belong at some point during adolescence. So gang members do commit a substantial share of delinquency in certain cities. because they're disproportionately involved in serious and violent delinquency. And lethal violence is more likely among gang members. In 2002, more than half of all homicides in LA and Chicago were gang related. Gang members are more likely to own, carry, and use guns. So, we want to also think about some myths associated with gang crime. So, gang members do not spend most of their time engaged in crime, and street gangs do not control drug sales in the US. Victims of gangs are infrequently innocent bystanders, although they have been from time to time. And street gangs are not all alike. So, what's the relationship then between gang membership and delinquency? Well, delinquent individuals are more likely to join gangs, and gang membership and delinquency are caused by a lot of the same factors. Gang membership also causes delinquencies. So, gang members tend to be poor and tend to live in lower income urban communities. They're predominantly male and young, and they often belong to minority groups and may often be organized along ethnic lines. As I mentioned earlier, some are highly organized, but most are loosely organized. They have core members and fringe members, very few well defined goals or rules, and membership changes frequently over time. The main thing that binds them together is conflict with other groups as opposed to any sort of internal cohesion. Girls may belong to a mixed sex gang, a female gang that's associated with male gangs like the Latin Kings and the Latin Queens, or be independent female gangs. They exercise a good deal of control over their own affairs and engage in a wide variety of delinquent acts, but they tend to be less delinquent than male members. And they join for similar reasons. But there are particular issues that are relevant for female gang members. They are most likely to be experiencing problems like abuse at home, and they may be seeking escape from gender oppression they encounter or anticipate encountering. So, reasons people join gangs: they want to socialize with friends, have fun, desire for a positive identity and status. In some communities, you may need to join for security and protection. There's generally an initiation ceremony, but most gang members leave within a year. They may witness the death or injury of a friend or become a direct victim of violence themselves. They may be incarcerated, or they may get a job, have children, or get married. So why do people join gangs, or why do gangs develop? Well, they may be a way to cope with strain. Perhaps you cannot acquire money or status through legitimate means. Many members feel neglected or abused by family members, and they may find their lives dull or boring. You're more likely to join a gang if your friends are gang members, if you live in a community where the gang members are respected, and if you are low in direct control and have a low stake in conformity. Why do these gangs often develop in deprived inner city communities? Well, these communities are lower in control. They have a lot of residential instability and few resources. There's a lot of strain in these communities, and that is resulting from trouble achieving monetary and status goals through legitimate channels. Conflicts with others may be a triggering factor that turn juveniles to gangs, and gangs may form in response to media portrayals of gang life. There was an increase in gangs in the 1970s, or since the 1970s, and this corresponds with a dramatic increase in the number of high poverty neighborhoods and the number of people living in such neighborhoods. There's a spread here to the working class and middle class communities. Just like crime stabilized in the late 90s to the mid to late 90s to early 2000s, for similar reasons: strong economy, decline in high poverty communities, and a decline in youth violence.